Primaries are over, special sessions underway. Welcome to This Week in Missouri Politics. We are joined by a guy that's going to be at the center. Now these primaries are done, you're at the center of everything. David Lenihan, a physician from South County, St. Louis, running to replace Scott Faughn. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate being on.
So tell me about your background, and you have big shoes to fill in Scott Faughn. Yeah. We saw it last night on the floor this past week when he was talking about these crime bills. He's a lawyer. You're a doctor running.
Yeah. Also a lawyer. Got a law degree from when I was dean of a medical school in New York. I was dean of a medical school in New York, and
and Bob Bondo have to have like a special handshake being doctor lawyers.
Special thing. So when I was dean up there, we had a law school, so I went to law school at night, and I don't practice. Wow. It's just part of just understanding a little bit of the law. I think will help give me some guidance on what to do when I'm in the Senate.
And there's been in recent years a real reduction in lawyers in the Senate. That's kind of been an uptick a little bit with Bill White coming in, and of course Bob Onder, Tony Luetkemeyer. You're actually not just a doctor that treats patients, though. You're someone that's actually putting together a hospital with a very historic to St. Louis name, right?
Yeah, Homer G. Phillips. So I have a kind of a history of where I've worked. Like I said, I was dean of a medical school in New York, in Harlem. So I worked downtown Harlem, North Miami, Puerto Rico. And so I'm president of a university in Puerto Rico that has now opened an extension campus in St. Louis. And the idea behind the hospital is how do we concentrate on cultural competency in healthcare? How do we make St. Louis, and this was always a vision I had for 20 years, how do we make St. Louis that center for delivery of cultural competency in healthcare?
All right, now you're a doctor, lawyer from St. Louis. I'm a simple West Butler County hillbilly. What does cultural competency mean?
So you treat people that are kind of similar to you. I'm going to give you a great example. I had heart issues a few years ago, and I went to a great hospital here, Missouri Baptist, wonderful facility. Doctor walks in the room and says, "Dave, we have a problem." In the room is my wife and me. So he says, he goes through what we got to do. I walk into a patient with the same physiology, the same problem in Puerto Rico. There's 20 people in the room. Grandma, grandpa, uncle, nephew, cousins. That's the cultural aspect. What you do medically is exactly the same. You give drugs, you do surgery, what do you do is the same. But how you handle that. And I'm going to give you an example. Do you touch somebody? We got COVID, so I'm not going to touch you, but you reach across.
You'd probably be more in danger than I would, I figured.
But do you touch somebody? That's an important aspect of healthcare. I'm an Irish Catholic boy from the Midwest. You don't touch me unless you absolutely have to. But in certain cultures, how you interact, do you touch, do you not? That's worth a lot because that improves how the patient reacts to the doctor, so it improves patient outcomes. It improves reimbursement rates for the health system. So this is an important part to our healthcare delivery. I've been speaking about this. I've done a TED Talk on it. I've been speaking about this for a long time. But now we're starting to recognize this, and as our rural hospitals are collapsing, as our urban healthcare systems are not performing how we need them to do, we need to understand how to get doctors into these communities who understand what the patients are experiencing so they can improve the healthcare. And that's what we want to do in North St. Louis. And what I want to do, and this is not politics, I was doing this before politics, is how do we make St. Louis the capital from West Virginia to Colorado, where the demographics of that population is changing? St. Louis is right in the center of that with a great education system, a great healthcare system. Let's make St. Louis the center of how we deal with cultural competency in healthcare, from our rural health systems, which have large Hispanic populations changing, to our urban core Rust Belt cities that have large African American populations. Let's get more doctors, let's get more healthcare workers like that into these communities to help improve the quality.
All right, you talked about being a physician, talked about getting care to folks. Right now in the middle of a pandemic, that seems like probably a quite topical and needed thing to discuss.
Yeah.
Tell me from your opinion as not a politician, but as a doctor, thus far, what's been the response here in Missouri and how well has it been on COVID?
So I get asked this a lot, and I look at this COVID thing as a disaster situation. I was a dean of a medical school in New York when Sandy hit. I was dean in Puerto Rico when Maria hit. We had earthquakes in Maria. One of the things I've learned is when you're in command, be in command. Make a decision. And it's real easy for all of us to sit back and criticize what Governor Parsons does, Dr. Page does, or Governor Cuomo did in New York. The one thing that we have to remember is these individuals are making tough decisions. Mm-hmm. And what I would say is we have to give them some ability to change course. One of the things in politics is we always criticize, oh, that was a mistake. The most important thing for a leader to do is to make a decision. Take a step forward. You can adjust it as you move along. And so I'm somewhat reluctant to criticize governors on the left or the right, as long as they're making a decision and moving it forward. And I have to say that I do think that what we're doing here in Missouri is probably a very nuanced approach, which is what we actually need our leaders to do. If you're in New York, you got to lock it down. If 5,000 people are living in a building, you're all sharing an elevator, you got to figure out some way to stop people from mixing to flatten that curve. If you're in rural Missouri, or even in my neighborhood in South County, my next door neighbor is 300 meters away, 300 yards away. We don't need that level of lockdown. So you need leaders that are going to be able to make decisions on nuanced approaches. And I have to say, I think Governor Parsons has done a good job. And while I don't always agree with what Dr. Page has done, I think he's probably making decisions based on the information he's getting. So I would support that.
Well, it looks like the folks in I guess, that Democrat primary was interesting in St. Louis County. I think you had a lot of Republicans took a ballot, maybe not to vote for Sam, but I think he got a better cross-reference, a better mandate maybe because of the large turnout he had from all over the county. So I guess there's at least a plurality of folks that like what he's doing.
And when you're in charge, people aren't always going to like everything you do, but
if they do, you probably got a bigger problem than a few of them don't.
Yeah, exactly.
It's scary. Let me ask you, talk about an issue that a lot of folks in St. Louis are talking about, now the whole state. It's crime. And I mean, people talk about it in code words, but essentially, Kansas City's had an uptick in violent crime, but really St. Louis City has had a huge uptick in violent crime. There's a special session about it right now. Folks in South County, I bet you if they were asked, I would say they're probably pretty pro-cop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm very pro-police, and I just want to throw that out there. The crime is rather interesting because we see all the protests and the things occurring on TV. I lived on 123rd and Lenox in Harlem. I lived in Ponce, Puerto Rico. These are not, South County per se. But one of the things I've noticed, regardless of where you're living and regardless of the socioeconomic classes, people want security. And I get asked, why do I want to run for politics? My whole career has been about how do I create opportunities for people. Opportunities create equality. That's what my whole career has been about. But if you don't have security coupled with that equality, it all goes to naught. We have to support the police. We have to give them the resources to protect the people. And I think you'd be very surprised if you went walking around North St. Louis, or you went walking around South St. Louis or Harlem or those places, the people in that community want the police. We see all the noise on the news, but people want security. If someone takes your car, you want to be able to call somebody to help.
There was a vote on Prop P in St. Louis County, passed overwhelmingly. Then they had a vote in the city, and it by a substantial margin. Folks not only are for law enforcement, they're willing to pay more money for it, which to me is like where the rubber meets the road. Let me ask you this question, though. I've asked a few folks on the show this. There's a lot of folks that have taken to the streets and protested. Not just African Americans, not just some skinny, white, liberal folks in the city. There's been a cross-section of Missouri. When this many Missourians see a problem, I think you almost are, I don't know that you can do a response that's just law and order. I think there needs to be, to actually address it, you may need a little more holistic approach because those folks have an opinion too.
That's a great question. One of the things we're doing with the hospital that we're building up Northside is we're also building a psychiatric center.
Yeah.
You have to deal with mental health issues if you really want to solve the crime issues. Yes, you can put more police out and you'll reduce the crime rate, but if you don't deal with the people in the mental health, then it just recycles back up. So we have to make sure we have the resources in our health system and our police system to deal with mental health. I am personally investing in building a psychiatry center in North St. Louis so that we can kind of take some of those frequent offenders off the street and get them the help. These people need help too.
Well, from a conservative perspective, it's probably cheaper to do that.
Well, yes. And we always want to talk about money, that's important, but it's the right thing to do. I mean, regardless if you're Democrat or a Democrat or Republican, it's the right thing to do because if you help people and give them opportunities, that's how you create equality. And that's a fundamental belief I believe in, and I think that's what I'm working on.
Let me ask you a question like this. Everybody running for the Senate. In the House, they do a PQ as a matter of business. It's a big body. It's meant to move things around. Senate's 34 members. They move the previous question, shuts off debate. What is your thoughts if you're heading into the Senate on the PQ?
So the PQ question, for those who might not know, it deals with the filibuster and whether or not you can do that. This has been part of the chamber since its history. I'm not going to disrespect that. I'm not going to change the PQ status quo. I'm not necessarily something that, it would have to be a massively extreme situation where I invoke that. Because if I use it against you, I'm kind of disrespecting you. I'm not giving you the opportunity to have your say. And I think in today's politics, we have enough of that where we're not letting people actually have their say. I want you to have your say. I might not agree with what you have to say, but I at least want to have the ability to listen to what you have to say.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Doc. I appreciate it.
No, thanks.
Good luck in the election.
Oh,
Take
what are we
care.
supposed to
We'll
do, right?
that either one. Speaking of, we'll be back. Go to showmissouri.com. We're back now doing the history of Herman when they gave me this terrific pin. If you have a free weekend, hit the Winers, hit their history museum. It's outstanding. Go to showmissouri.com, learn the history of Missouri one county at a time. We'll be right back after this with Gene Evans on the show.
Your energy needs are changing. That's why at Ameren, Missouri, we're not waiting on the future. We're building it with the Smart Energy Plan, advancing thousands of projects across the state, helping reduce emissions through cleaner energy sources, boost reliability with self-healing equipment, and better withstand storms with new composite poles. Moving Missouri forward and bringing us all a little closer together. That's energy at work. Ameren, Missouri.
Mike Parson served in law enforcement for 22 years. A former sheriff, Parson is tough on crime. Governor Parson is standing up for victims, investing in better mental health services, and cracking down on violent crime and drugs. Governor Parson's anti-crime initiatives have led to the arrests of hundreds of violent criminals and gang members. A former sheriff, a conservative, tough on crime governor. Mike Parson is making Missouri families safer.
Welcome to This Week in Missouri Politics, Opinion Maker Panel Time. Brett Dinkins, Victory Enterprise, welcome back to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Gene Evans, former legislator, now the director of the Republican Party. Welcome back.
Good to be here.
We have not Twitter Gene, right? We have real Gene.
We have real Gene.
Wiley Price, representative here in St. Louis. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Forrest Richardson, the campaign manager for Yinka Faleti, Democratic operative from Savannah, Missouri, right?
Yeah, happy
The
to
Savannah
be here.
Savages, is that what it is? I've read a little bit in the paper.
It is.
There
it
we
is.
go.
We're trying to get that changed, though.
Well, you know, just leave the Neelyville Tigers alone if you don't mind. Brother, let's talk about the elections here. I think two things, shock in St. Louis and a mixed bag other round. Bruce Franks told me about, in this lobby of this building, about 3 or 4 years ago, Cori Bush is going to win. She's going to win. I'm like, Bruce, I pulled the, I've watched this a long time. It's not really going to happen. And Bruce was like, no, she's going to win. And it took an extra time, but she did.
Yeah, so I think you're right. Bruce did call it first. I've seen him on Facebook saying it for weeks now. You know, this is a bigger trend of what we're seeing across the country, specifically in Democrat primaries, but it's not exactly unlike the energy that got Trump elected, which is people feeling very disfranchised with the current system, the status quo, the candidates you typically see people flock to, and they're willing to throw out seniority, they're willing to throw out power, Ivy League degrees, to get someone that they feel like is like them and really going to be a voice for their community.
Wiley Price, you're here in St. Louis. I was glad when you had the time to be on the show because I think that to the rest of the state, they're like, what happened? So what did happen?
I think, again, I'd have to agree with Chris there. I think this is a shot at D.C. I think that this is going back to the basics of having people that are of the people represent the people, and not this idea of status quo. Even though that Lacey has been great in my opinion for the state, it's Sarah at this point. We got to move forward.
Do you know Cori Bush? Have you met her?
I have not met her. Looking forward to meeting her and building that relationship. But from what I can tell, she is of the soil.
Forrest Richardson, tell me about on the ground. You're working in Democrat primary politics right now. From a political perspective, what happened?
Yeah, well, I think it speaks to truly some of the anti-incumbency fervor in the country right now. I actually saw earlier this week that this is the most incumbent representatives in the House of Representatives that have lost their primaries since 1970 in a non-redistricting year. So I think it speaks to some of the energy around the country, some of the frustration with the current leadership, and some desire to get that changed.
Gene Evans, Cori Bush. I have met her. She's a very nice person. There is a phonetic energy around her. But defund the police, but raise taxes. There's a lot of positions that we've heard from, well, that's what people in New York or Los Angeles or where they try to shut down Seattle or take it over. You now have someone who will say these things openly right here in Missouri. My assumption is the Missouri Republican Party is thrilled to see the new Congresswoman.
Right. Well, she's bringing the squad right here to Missouri, and it was interesting that Nicole Galloway immediately endorsed her. So we have someone who is a Bernie supporter, openly supports socialism, openly supports defund the police, and she's been embraced by the leader of the Democrat Party. So this is no longer an East Coast or a West Coast thing. It's come to Missouri, and our Republicans will take note. And even a lot of Democrats are not socialists and don't want to defund the police. So it's going to be interesting to see how Galloway's embrace of this candidate pans out for her campaign.
It's a terrible spot. I mean, if Nicole didn't embrace her, she would have never heard the end of it. If she probably was smart, just get off the agenda. But I would say coming to a mailbox in South County will be a very interesting introduction of the new Congresswoman by the Missouri Republican Party.
That's right, and I think that Nicole's going to be in a really tough spot because Nicole does not want to say the words defund the police, but this is a generation of people running for Congress who are not afraid to take on their Democrat leaders too. And so when Corey starts putting that pressure on Nicole to take these further left positions than what Nicole wants to say, even though she probably does agree with them, she's going to be in a really tough spot, and she might not have the same support for Corey that she's offering to Corey.
Well, Price, you got a candidate, let's say down in South County, Michael O'Donnell has a person running against him.
Sure.
I would say if I'm Michael O'Donnell, I'm getting me some good pictures of Corey Bush and I'm sending them out in my mailers. What do you tell a House candidate that maybe isn't for defunding the police and maybe isn't a socialist? How do you interact with them? I mean, that's an interesting conundrum now that Missouri Democrats have to deal with.
I think that there has to be clarity on what defund the police is. I think that there are two different narratives. I think there is abolishing the police, which is what some people want to do, and then there's defunding the police, which is the reallocation of funds, reallocating those funds into the city and actually investing in the city instead of divesting in these kind of services.
Let's talk about the Senate primaries. You had kind of a mixed bag all around. You had in the western part of the state, Rick Bratton and Mike Moon won. Probably join the conservative caucus, bring them up to 8 members. Other parts of the southern Missouri, you had Holly Ray, I don't think he would say is a firebrand. Carl Esslinger, Jason Bean, more traditional Republican candidates, and Lane Gannon. Sort of a mixed verdict, Missouri Republicans sitting in the state Senate primaries.
Well, as you know, senators are very independent, and I think you'll see these senators reflect the views of their particular districts and represent them. We have a very diverse state in terms of thoughts and how we proceed. And the other thing is, you cannot discount the campaigns that were run. A couple of these folks who were underdogs ran great campaigns and really did the hard work, and it makes a difference. Campaigning, going door to door, or in this case, maybe it's phone calls, but really reaching out to voters makes a huge difference. And we saw some close races where the candidate who worked the hardest won.
What would you say? I mean, if you're running statewide, if you're Eric Schmidt right now, and you're looking around some of these primary results, it's like, well, where is the kind of the thoughts of the Missouri Republican Party?
Sure. Well, I think what we saw in the Senate primary specifically was voters coming home to the candidates they knew, regardless of the money they spent. When you look at turnout by county, geography. Exactly. They went back to the names they knew and trusted after all the money was spent and everything was said and done. They chose the names they were familiar with, and that, to Eric Schmidt, I would say you got to get on the ground and get to know these people firsthand.
Well, probably tell me about, so in Kansas City, you had Barb Washington won by a landslide, so did Greg Razor. I think, you may have a real star in Greg Razor. I think he's going to be a very important member of the
Strongly
Senate.
agree.
In St. Louis, you had 2 primaries. I wasn't a surprise if you've known the Walton family. That was a surprise that she won that. And Alan Green pulling some votes at probably Tommy's, right?
I have to give you a little pushback on that. I was all the way shocked by that win. Definitely the Waltons are a machine up in North County, but I was expecting Tommy to pull that out.
I think most folks were surprised, shocked. I think there was some folks I knew that said, well, the Waltons are going to run a good campaign.
Every time. But, I mean, they have lost. And I thought that this would be one of those times. In regards to Steve Roberts' run, I think that's a great look. I think it sends a great message to the city of St. Louis as well as the state to have 2 black senators down there in the 4th and the 5th. I think that is how it should be moving forward.
It was a huge night for black women all around, but I do think with some of the issues that are being discussed right now, I've watched how important it can be, not even on the Senate floor, but just at dinner, to have a black man's perspective when you're talking about issues of policing.
Oh man. Obviously, that's going to be critical. Anytime that we have, I always use the example of the Trump-Hillary campaign. All the Trumpsters knew that Trump was going to win, and all the people that were going for Hillary knew that Hillary was going to win. We surround ourselves in these bubbles, and we don't allow outside perspective. And oftentimes, that's where the disconnect is when we come with these hardcore issues like police brutality.
And there's frankly some things that Stephen Roberts has lived and seen that I don't have that perspective.
Without doubt.
And I would say, even if you break it down, maybe even a little more, sometimes it's hard for a black woman and a black man to have. You can't really live something until you've lived it and totally take it.
I think a great example of that is the situation right now with Breonna Taylor. Everybody's talking about that situation now. She's dead and gone, yes, and justice for Breonna Taylor, yes. But her very black male boyfriend is in jail right now for shooting at a cop for trying to protect his queen in his home.
Forrest, tell me about these primaries. You're now looking around the state of Missouri. I would say Medicaid had to make you guys feel like there's at least an issue that you can campaign on that has majority support.
Absolutely. I think the fact Amendment 2 passed around the state is a great thing for the state of Missouri generally. But I think it also bodes very well for Democrats in November. I mean, look, to be honest, we know the governor's record on this, on Clean Missouri, on right to work. He's pushed back and tried to overturn the will of the people. I think if this election's about healthcare and about Medicaid expansion, and I think it will be due to the crisis we find ourselves in, then I think that bodes well for Nicole Galloway.
I'm excited. Carl Bearden, I believe, owes me a beer. Brett Dinkins, I think that it was closer than some folks even thought, even though it was a decent margin of victory. There was a campaign that got ran at the end. If that campaign would have been a sustained campaign, I think no wins, right?
That's right. Yeah, this was certainly not a mandate. I think to try to apply it to a greater cause on what's going to happen statewide is wrong. There was not a true opposition campaign ran over the course of a year like the governor has been running for, like Secretary of State Ashcroft has been running for, that's going to be funded and active throughout the state. That wasn't the case with Medicaid expansion, and it still almost went down. There was not this huge mandate for Medicaid expansion. We'll see what the legislature does, but to try to apply it to their statewide races, I think it would be not wise.
Now, the folks in the cities, the big hospitals, paid for a great campaign, and they told us all we're going to have rural health care. You think the legislature's going to make them actually have rural health care?
I never know with this Republican legislature. They seem to go against the vote of the people quite often. There are plenty of examples in the recent past with, I can't think of any right off the top of my head just because I'm freezing up, but yeah.
There was a bunch of St. Louis hospitals, Kansas City hospitals, that paid for a campaign that promised rural health care. Do you think, while you don't have any rural members in leadership outside Dave Schatz, do you think they'll make them actually produce rural health care now?
Well, to kind of go back to what he said, there was a $10 million campaign to support this initiative, and it passed largely in the urban suburban areas. So the folks that are going to implement this are from areas that did not support the expansion. So you look at Cody Smith's area where they voted against it. He's the chair of the budget. Now, they have to follow the law. This was passed, right? But it puts our Republican representatives in a difficult spot because their constituents are saying, we don't want this, we didn't vote for it, and yet the law is telling them to implement it. We have a very, very generous Medicaid system here. There's going to have to be some sort of cuts there and in education to pay for this system. Now, there has been some talk that there's a magic wand that is going to produce, more money to the state. If that happens, I will applaud it. I will buy you guys a steak dinner, but I just don't see that happening.
I think there's a business argument that in year 3, 4, this becomes neutral maybe, or the amount of money isn't huge. But in years 1, 2, there's going to be some outlet. And that's just, I've never bought into that line that it would produce on year 1.
No, well, we also have Todd Richardson running that, and there have been hundreds of millions of dollars going to pay for people who don't even live in Missouri anymore to pay for their Medicaid. If he can find a way to fix some of the abuses of the system, that will certainly help. But it's going to be tough, and it also depends on the economy. How many people are out of work, and how many people are going to be relying, and how many business owners decide, they're going to cut health care and let the state pay for it.
Before it was all the charity you could afford, but now it's in the Constitution. You're going to pay for that charity either way. Mm-hmm. Brett Dinkins, tell me about this governor's race. Shaped up now. Parson, I think he put a little effort into it. I think he wanted to. Hawley got 58% in his primary. Blunt got, I think, 72. He ended up with over 72% of the vote. Pretty good mandate for the governor.
Yeah, I agree. I think there was a lot of kind of Facebook energy maybe to make this seem like it was
interesting how not real Facebook is.
Correct. Yeah. So there was a lot of Facebook energy around this competitive primary he had, but it just never materialized. And I think it shows that the party is united around the governor, that he has deep core support within the Republican Party. And I think we'll see that continue and spread to the independent voters when they are put up against a candidate like Nicole Galloway, who does support defunding the police and who does support the implementation of Obamacare and some of these things that these rural counties simply will not ever vote for.
Well, the rest of you, Nicole Galloway, you were able to avoid a primary, which would have been, there would have been a lot of challenges. She would won the primary, but she'd had to address a lot of issues she didn't have to address if she had a primary. Very beneficial to her, but I've seen her come right out the day after the primary. I think people were starting to say, you're a serious person, Nicole. When are you going to start addressing issues? She did. She said she'd have a statewide mask mandate. She did endorse Congresswoman-elect Bush. I thought the campaign really started. I think she took the baton and kind of started it herself.
I think that Nicole is showing leadership. I think she's showing the ability to not be afraid to pull the trigger. And I think that is the exact opposite of what our current leadership has been doing. They've had a very wait-and-see approach, and I don't think that has been effective for any of the people of Missouri.
Forrest Richardson, yeah, you're involved in statewide races. I mean, if I'm looking at the map of Medicaid, let's say, and you're looking, it's really moved to maybe you get a little St. Charles, you go a little Platte County, Clay County, and then your normal cities versus rural mentality breaks down, maybe a little Greene County. Is that kind of the map? If you're Nicole Galloway, you're going to follow?
I think to an extent. I mean, part of the equation is having significant advantages in the cities. But let's not forget on Medicaid expansion. I mean, I know it's really easy to compartmentalize it into these blue counties and these red counties. On that map that everyone's been passing around this week, those red counties had over 200,000 votes for Medicaid expansion. And that shows you that there is energy on the ground. They'd like you to believe that all these rural Missourians would never want to pass Medicaid. There are 200,000 Missourians in rural counties who voted for that.
What do you think? Looking at now you're sitting at the map Wednesday morning. What were you thinking of the race?
Well, we had 20% higher Republican turnout. The governor absolutely killed it in terms of the percentage he got. There was really no opposition. He got another $2.5 million worth of support this week. I mean, things look very good, better than I could have hoped for in terms of the governor's race.
With a minute left, who won the week?
I'm going to say Senator Eigel. He fended off a tough primary, over $300,000 spent against him, and ended up with more than 70% of the vote, so a good week for him.
Won the week?
I got to say Mike Parson, absolutely, and particularly with Nicole endorsing Cori Bush, that's going to be a tough thing for her to overcome.
Won the week?
I'd have to say undeniably black women in all the elections that were won.
No question. Won the week?
The 230,000 Missourians will now have Medicaid.
Sure. I'm going to say somebody that I think maybe didn't win the week, but I think maybe won the next 10 years. And that's now soon to be former Congressman Lacey Clay. What a legacy his family has left, not only St. Louis, but the entire state. You can go over almost anywhere in this area and find something that a member of the Clay family has helped bring to this area. I'd say maybe not this week, but I think probably the next 10 years he'll smile a lot more. Congrats to Congressman Lacey Clay on a job well done to his whole family. We will see you next week from the State Fair with Governor Parson on This Week in Missouri Politics.
This Week in Missouri Politics, sponsored by the Missouri Association of Career Fire Protection Districts, Spire, and Sterling Bank.